So let's get started on how to factor in Algebra 1. When somebody asks you to factor something in Algebra 1, the very first thing that you need to check is the greatest common factor. They're usually going to give you some type of polynomial, a binomial, a trinomial, whatever they give you. Always check the greatest common factor, or GCF, first. So a little simple example here. This is a binomial. They're going to ask me to factor this. So the very first thing I need to do is find the greatest common factor of each term. I need to find the biggest number that will go into each one of these terms. I need to find the biggest number that will go into 2 and 12. Well, the biggest number that will go into 2 and 12 is 2. So, second thing I need to do, whatever the greatest common factor is, I write it on the outside of a set of parentheses. So let's do that. I'm going to equal, the greatest common factor of 2 and 12 is 2. I'm going to put it on the outside of parentheses. And how do I get what goes inside the parentheses? I divide each one of those terms by the greatest common factor. So how do I get what goes inside the parentheses? I'm going to divide each one of those terms by the greatest common factor. So I want to show you what I'm doing. Sometimes this is just what goes on in people's heads as they're figuring this out. I'm going to take each one of these terms and I'm going to divide it by this greatest common factor. Put a 2 right there and a 2 right there. And now I'm going to divide each one of these, and what I have left over, I'm going to put it inside the parentheses. So 2x divided by 2, 2 divided by 2 is 1x left over, 1x. Positive 12 divided by 2, positive 6. And I close my parentheses. So those rules again, when they give you any polynomial, the very first thing you need to do is try to factor out the greatest common factor when they're asking you to factor it. Once you figure out what the greatest common factor is, write it on the outside of a set of parentheses. How do you get what goes inside the parentheses? Divide each one of those terms by that greatest common factor. So let's look at another example like this one right here. I've got 24x squared minus 18. So remembering my rules, the very first thing I need to do is find the biggest number that will go into 24 and 18. Well, 2 will go into both of them. They're both even. 4 won't go into 18. 4 will go into 24 6 times, but it won't go into 18. How about 6? Will 6 go into 24 and 18? 6 will go into both of them. Let's try 6. Now, I put a 6 on the outside of a set of parentheses, and what I'm going to do is I want to divide each one of these by 6, and that's what I'm going to put inside the parentheses. Now, if I divide each one of these by 6, and there's another number that will go into each one of them, I'm going to divide that number out and multiply it to what's on the outside right here. But I'm going to try 6 and see if 6 is the greatest common factor of each one of these terms. 24x squared divided by 6. 24 divided by 6 is 4x squared. Negative 18 divided by 6, negative 3. And I closed my parentheses. I've factored out the greatest common factor. I have split this into two products. 6, which is a monomial, and 4x squared minus 3, which is a binomial inside there. I figure out the biggest number that will go into every term that they give me. So let's look at one that has more terms than those. Instead of finding the greatest common factor of just the first two, I find the greatest common factor of every term that they give me. Doesn't matter how many it is. So I need to find the biggest number that will go into 4, 8, and 8. 4 will go into each one of those, and I think it's the biggest number that it'll go into each one of those. I put a 4 on the outside of the parentheses, and how do I get what goes inside the parentheses? I divide each one of those by 4. I divide this one by 4, this one by 4, and this one by 4. So 4x squared divided by 4. 4 divided by 4 is 1. That means I have an x squared left over inside there. Negative 8x divided by 4. Negative 8 divided by 4 is negative 2x. And 8 divided by 4, positive 2. And I close my parentheses. I'm simply factoring out the greatest common factor, and this is the first thing you always do when somebody asks you to factor something. You always factor out the greatest common factor. So let's try some that have variables in it. Like this one right here. This one right here has a variable. So we're still going to do what we normally do. I'm going to look for the biggest number that will go into 2 and 16. That's 2. But since this is the greatest common factor, I need to find something else they have in common. Each one of these terms has something else in common. They have a variable in common. And what variable do they have in common? That x. So not only am I going to put a 2 on the outside of the parentheses, I'm going to put a 2x on the outside of the parentheses. How do I get what goes inside the parentheses? I divide each one of these by that greatest common factor out there. I divide this one by 2x, and I divide this one by 2x. So 2 divided by 2 is 1. And if we remember our law of exponents, I subtract in this situation. I take away. It's like I started off with 2 x's, I take 1 away, I've got 1 left over on the inside. Negative 16 divided by 2 is negative 8. And x divided by x, x minus x, there should be no x's left over down here on the end. So I close that parentheses. So if they have a letter in common or a variable in common, you pull that out here where the greatest common factor is. Not only you find the biggest number, but you look and see if they have any letters they have in common. So let's try another one like this right here. 8x squared plus 16x. I need to find the biggest number that will go into 8 and 16. That's 8. And then I'll look and see if they have any letters in common. And they do. They both have an x in common. So I'm going to put an x out here on the outside. 8x is the greatest common factor of each one of these. How do I get what goes inside the parentheses? I divide each one of these by 8x. So let's do that. 8x squared divided by 8x. 8 divided by 8 is 1. Subtract right here and I have 1x left over. 2 minus this 1 down here is 1 left over on the inside. 16 divided by 8 is positive 2. And x divided by x, if I subtract my exponents, which is what I'm supposed to do in that situation, I should have no x's left over down there on the end.